Good evening and welcome to this, our virtual Universal Hall. I'm Peter Vallance, Artistic Director here of Universal Hall Promotions and also one of the storytellers who'll be telling tonight. But before we begin the telling, I wanted to, for myself as much as anyone, just reminisce a little about all the people who performed here in Universal Hall over the years. For, like so many venues around the world, we've been shut here since March. So I wanted to take this opportunity to look back just for a moment, remembering all the great nights many of you out there have perhaps enjoyed here in the Universal Hall. And the artists, many of them could be struggling a bit. And I'd encourage you, if you've got a little bit of spare cash, just go to an artist website, any artist, and just buy a CD from them, a mug, a t-shirt, just anything to keep them going through these difficult times. I'd like to thank also Creative Scotland, continue to support us, the Scottish International Storytelling Festival, of course. Over the years, you'll have seen some of them here behind me. We've had many shows from them. And I'd also like to thank the Fintorn Foundation, the owners of this beautiful building and guardians of it and all that happens within it. So, I'm going to pass you over now to the storytelling show. In fact, I think I'm going to pass myself over to myself to introduce and tell the first story. I'm hoping, if you're watching this live, there'll be a little chat function running along the side, and I'll be there to answer any questions and post a few links to other things that are happening and things you might be interested in. So, thank you, and on with the show. Hello, and welcome to our storytelling ceilidh. I'm Peter Vallance, and the other tellers tonight are Carol Scorer and Margot Henderson. Now, I think it's safe to say that none of us would be here tonight were it not for the legacy of the Scottish travellers, those who have passed down the stories, cared for them and nurtured them. 'Tis such a story I will begin the ceilidh with tonight, a story I learnt from Willie McPhee, and it is set in just such a ceilidh. For it was the tradition hereabouts in the northeast that at this time of the year, with all the harvest in, the laird would gather all the workers of the estate together and have a great ceilidh that everybody had to contribute to. And whoever told the best story, sang the best song, he would get a golden guinea from the laird himself. And so it was, late into the night, the evening went. But now it is that we've come to the very last person in the great hall. So, Davy, they said, it's your turn now. What are you going to do for us? Oh, said Davy, you know, I'm not that kind of person, you know, stories, singing and that. No, there's nothing I can do. Well, the laird said, you know what it is. If you can't do something, you'll have to pay a forfeit. I know, says Davy, I know. And there have been some terrible forfeits over the years. So Davy was expecting the worst, and he was a bit surprised when the laird said to him, Davy, this is what I want you to do. I want you to go to the harbour, you know my boat there, and bring back the bailer that's in it. Is that it? Says Davy. Yes, says the laird, that's it. Away you go. So Davy, with his tackety boots, rat-a-tat-tat, he goes down the lane, down the steps to the boat in the harbour, and it's dark, and he's casting about for the bailer there, and doesn't he slip on the mossy boards, and bangs his head, and when he awakes, isn't the boat softly rocking to and fro? And he pulls himself up and looks out, and all he can see, as far as the eye can see, is the sea. But Davy, he was never the kind to panic or worry. In a difficult situation, he'd always just pull his pipe out, a plug of tobacco, and have a wee smoke. So he went down into his pocket for his pipe. But there was no pipe. There was no pocket. There was just a smooth silk dress running down to smooth silk stockings, running down to dainty high-heeled silk shoes. Oh my, says Davy, what's happened to my tackety boots? And then, putting up his hand to his usually bristly chin, as smooth as silk was it also, and my voice, he says, my voice, what's happened to my voice? Well, there was no oars, there was no sail, and the boat seemed to have a life of its own. And where it was taking Davy he did not know. It took him through the mists, out to sea, and then, suddenly, he was almost asleep and dozing. The boat grounded on the shore. Well, Davy was about to jump out into the shallow water when suddenly he heard a voice from the shore. Wait there, I'll lift you up and carry you. I don't want you getting wet, you beautiful woman, you. And there, a great hairy farmer coming towards delicate Davy, scooped him up in his arms and carried him to shore. Thank you very much, said Davy. Thank you very much. Well, to cut a long story short, Davy and the local farmer, for that's who he was, soon got very well acquainted, and in due course married they were, and 2 bairns they had, and they were the delight of Davy's eye. Oh, he'd dandle them on his knee, he'd throw them in the air, he'd kiss and cuddle them, he'd suckle them at his breast. Well, Davy was happy. Happy he was in the married life. And one day, the family, they were walking along the shore, and Davy saw the old boat. It must have been lying there for 3 years. And he thought to himself, I never did find that baler. And he just wanted, for old time's sake, a little look into the boat. Just wait there a moment, he said to the family. And he went into the boat, and he was looking here, he was looking there, and didn't he slip again? Bang his head. And the family, seeing the boat almost propelled out to sea, ran out after it, but it quickly went out to sea, and when Davy awoke, there he was again, rocking gently backwards and forwards. And the first thing he thought about, of course, was his bairns. My bairns, he said, with tears rolling down his eyes. Where are my bairns? And what's happened to my voice? And there was stubble again on his chin, and he looked down, and there was his tackety boots, and all his old clothes back again. But Davy had thought only for his bairns. He was crying and greeting all the way as the ship carried him back to the harbour that he'd left all those years ago. And up the steps he went, with his boots rat-a-tat-tat on the stairs, up the lane to the laird's big house. He burst into the great hall, and there everyone was, gathered. Not gathered again, but still there, it looked like from the ceilidh. Well, says the laird to Davy, where's my baler? But Davy, he's just greeting and screaming, my bairns, what's happened to my bairns? What, says the laird, has something happened? You better tell us all what's happened. And Davy told the tale as I have told it to you. And at the end, the laird and everyone else agreed it was the best tale they'd heard that night. And Davy got the golden guinea. That's the story I heard from Willie McPhee. And I'm glad to tell it to you tonight. and may it bring safety and peace to you all. So now it is time to continue with the next teller, Carol Scorer. And she's going to tell you a story of the Salmon of Wisdom. And behind her, you will see one of the Pictish hangings of Mariana lines that she collected from the Pictish stones all around the northeast. And this particular one is from Glamis Manse. And on it, there's a snake, an adder, a mirror, and the salmon itself. And people sometimes say, looking at the hanging, well, that salmon's upside down. Surely the hanging's upside down. But no, it is not upside down, for the salmon is leaping, of course, in the hanging. Now we're very close here to the Fintorn River. And the Fintorn River, you may not realise, takes its name from one of the characters in this tale. For the Fintorn River, named it is after Finn MacCool, great warrior that he is. And the second part of the name, they say 'tis from Erne, as in Strathern, the goddess that you find in Ireland, one of the great rivers that goes towards the sea. And so, Carol, away with your story now. Thank you.
So, a while back I was visiting some friends in West Cork, and we went for a walk up a hill overlooking the sea, and we saw a hare. And my friend said to me, you know, round here the hares, well, they're often shapeshifters. They often are people from the other world. And it reminded me how there are places and times where the other world and this world are interchangeable. And there are certain places, like maybe it's a hill or a boulder in the river, where you might find yourself going into the other world and wake up years later. And my story today is set in times such as this. There are stories told all over the world about the great warrior clan who roamed Ireland and Scotland. And the stories told about Finn MacCool, who was their chief for a while. And I'm going to tell you a story of Finn MacCool as a boy. So, as well as this shape-shifting and magic and poetry, there was also a lot of battles and rivalries. And Finn MacCool's father was killed in battle, and the person who killed him took over, being the chief of the Fianna. And Finn's mother, well, Finn was just a babe in arms, and she knew the only way to keep him safe was to take him into a secret place, into the heart of the forest. So Mona Munkim, Finn's mother, set off in the dead of the night with only one trusted companion, until she found her two sister-in-laws who lived in the heart of the forest. And these two women, Finn's aunties, were to bring him up. So one of them, Beaumol, she was a druid, and she would teach him all the ways of the forest, the herbs, the plants, the leaves, the animals, and the potions he could make. And Leah Luca, well, she was the warrior, and she was also a trainer of warriors, and she would teach him how to run as swift as a deer, and how to leap over branches as high as his own chest and go under branches lower than his knee, and even pull out a thorn from his foot without losing pace. And he also had to learn how to be buried up to the waist and defend himself from the arrows of 9 enemies with nothing more than a hazel twig. and he learnt well. He was a bright boy. And the years went by until Finn started to grow a sort of shadow above his lip, and his voice began to break. And Leah, one day she came back from the forest and said, "There are strangers. I think it is time." And so they told Finn to always call himself Devnir from that day on. And they dyed his hair black instead of the fair that it was, and sent him off to the next chapter of his life. So have you ever seen the salmon leaping against the rapids? Even though the water's really forceful, they leap again and again and again against the flow, following an inner flow that's even stronger. The salmon that can live in fresh water and sea water. Such a determined fish. And the salmon in this story was no ordinary salmon, for it had once been of human form and had shifted its shape into the salmon. There is a well, which is the source of all the rivers of the land, and this well is known as the Well of Knowledge. And around this well there are 9 hazel trees, and each hazel tree dropped a nut into the water. And each of these nuts of knowledge, the salmon came and ate them. And so it gained all the knowledge of the land itself, and could see into the future and into the past at the same time. And there was a prophecy that whoever would eat of this salmon would have all the wisdom themselves, and they'd be able to see into the past and the future at the same time, and have all the knowledge of the land. And there was also, in the prophecy, it would said that Finn would catch this fish. So old Finnegas, the poet druid, he had spent 7 years fishing for this salmon, looking at the pool day after day after day, determined to catch it, and sure it was for him. So when Bulmul sent Finn to study with old Finnegas, Finnegas was glad of the company, a strong young man to help him with his chores and his wood, and perhaps fixing up his old hut, doing some cooking. But it was only 3 days after Finn had come to study with him that Finnegas called the salmon. It had a golden glow around it, and it was huge. At last he gave it to Finn. He said, you may cook it, but please, whatever you do, you must not eat any of it. Certainly, said Finn. Now Finnegas was overcome with a strange sleepiness, so he went to have a lie down. So Finn, he got the fire going, and when it was the right temperature, he carefully placed the salmon on the spit and carefully started to cook it. And when it was nearly cooked, he took it off, ready, and put it on a plate, and he saw that there was a blister, and wanting it to look just right, he pressed the blister with his thumb, and the juices came and spurted and burnt his thumb. Ow! strange sensation came over him when he handed the cooked salmon to Finnegas. Old Finnegas said, "You look different. You haven't eaten any of this, have you?" No, not at all. Well, I did press the blister and get some juice on my thumb and... Tell me, boy, you haven't another name as well as Devney, do you? Well, yes, they also call me Finn. Finn! Oh, take it. It's yours. This was meant for you. 7 years. And so, that is how Finn McCool, whenever he wanted to see into the past and the future, at the same time he would just put his thumb into his mouth and bite it gently between his teeth, and he would have the wisdom, which, as you can imagine, brought great joy and great pain to him in his life. And there are many more stories that tell of these things. And that is the end of the Finn McCool story for today.
Many thanks for that, Carol. Carol, as you can see, works with drumming as well. She has many classes, works in local schools and museums. Thank you again, Carol Scorer. Moving on to our next teller, Margot Henderson, a well-known local poet, singer and storyteller, working also in schools and in nature. Margot, tell us your tale.
It's wonderful to be telling a story for the In the Flow Scottish Storytelling Festival. And I'm telling this story here on Findhorn Bay, where the river Findhorn pours into the tidal bay, and the bay is fed at the other side by the sea, so the river pours into the sea. So we're very blessed with water here. And water is a very sacred element in Celtic tradition. It's the doorway to the other world. It's where the old wifeys might sit and look and scry the future and tell your fortune. It's the wells where you would go to make some wishes or say your prayers for healing. It's the rivers where the kelpies would take you off and you'd never be seen again. It's the seas where the selkies and the mermaids swim. It's where the elementals live. So geographically and mythically, we are blessed with water. So I'm going to tell you a story called Sealskin, Soulskin. And it's a story that can be found in so many places, wherever the land meets the sea. Long ago, on a midsummer eve, a fisherman was finding his way home. He'd had a hard day, and he hadn't caught much at all. And he was feeling fair sorry for himself. He'd been beguiled a few times, seeing a glimmer of light on the water and thinking it was a shoal of fish, but it was nothing but the sun glittering on the waves. And he knew that when he went home, there would be no fire lit, the place would be dark. He'd have to cook his own dinner, and he'd nobody to share it with, and nobody to share his bed with either. So he's making his way back, not feeling too great, when as he drew close to the shore, he heard strange voices singing. Honda, hondo, honda, ru-da-da, honda, hondo, honda, ru-da-da. And the sound made the skin on his back begin to prickle, and the hairs at the back of his neck rose up. He quietly moored the boat at the edge of the shore and tiptoed up the sand. He had to know who was singing. He hid behind a rock, and there he saw a sight that not many are ever likely to see. He saw the most beautiful women dancing in a circle and singing, with their long hair down their backs and their beautiful bright eyes and their silky bodies, naked as the day they were born. Only these were no normal women, and he knew that as soon as he saw them. He knew these were the Selkies that his grandmother had told him of. These were the seals that come on land when the veil between the worlds is thin, and shed their skins and dance as beautiful women. And he knew also that if he was to take one of these skins, then the woman would have to come home with him. So he cast his eyes around the circle, seeing that one woman was more beautiful than the next. But at last his eyes set on one, and he didn't take his eyes off her. He sat in a crouch and he waited and watched. And after a time, who knows how long it was, the first glimmers of dawn began to light in the morning. And one by one the women wrapped themselves again in their sealskins and dived back into the water. And just as the woman of his choice was about to reach for her skin, he ran and snatched it before she could have it. And they looked at each other eye to eye. And she reached out her hand and said, "Give me back what's mine." And he said, "I can't give it back." And she looked at him and she knew that he would not give her back her skin. But she asked again, "Give me back my skin. I can't be myself without it." And he said, "No, I can't give it back. Come home with me." And she looked at him and she looked at her sisters waiting for her in the water, and she knew she couldn't survive there without her skin. And she said to him, "I will stay with you for 7 years, but promise me that at the end of that time you will give me back my skin and let me go home to my people and the sea." In that moment, he would have said anything for her to come home with him. So he said, "Yes, I will, I promise." So she went home with him. And as soon as they got home, he hid her skin. So in the days and the weeks that followed, she learnt how to be on land, how to cook and clean and keep house for him. But she would often go down to the edge of the shore looking for her sisters, and they would come to the edge of the shore and sing to her. Honda, hondo, honda, ru-da-da. And she would go home to the house with tears in her eyes and the salt tears running down her cheeks. But the man never seemed to notice. After a short time, she grew big and she had a baby. And this was her first glimmer of joy, her beautiful Selkie boy slithering out of her. And she loved him from the first, and she held him close and she looked after him well. And this was her one brightness in her days, her little boy. And he grew and grew until 7 years had passed. And the little boy knew his mother loved him, but when he looked in her eyes, he knew she was sad, but he didn't know why. And then one night he heard his parents have an argument. 7 years have passed. You promised me, so now I must leave you. Give me back my skin. The man said, what are you talking about? You can't leave me. You're the mother of my son, and you're my wife. I will not give you back your skin. But you promised me. Aye, well, that was a long time ago, and things have changed since then. And once again she knew he would not give her back her skin. And that night she cried herself to sleep. The next day her little boy wanted to play, and sometimes he liked to play hide and seek, where he would go and hide in the byre or somewhere around the place, and she would have to find him. And this day he hid in the byre, burrowing into the straw and the hay. And as he burrowed in, he felt beneath him something soft and silky. He pulled the straw and the hay away, and he pulled it out. It smelt of the sea. It smelt of his mother. And he knew, though he didn't know how he knew, but he knew she would be pleased that he'd found it. And he brought it to his mother. Mother, what's this? And when she saw it, her eyes lit up. Her heart beat fast. And this was a moment of such joy. She would be able to be herself again. But then when she looked down at her beautiful boy, she realised what this would mean. They would never be able to live together in the same way again. So under her arm she took her skin, and with her other hand she took the hand of her little boy, and she walked him down to the edge of the shore. And when they got there, she sang to her sisters, Honda, Hondo, Honda, Ro-da-da. And her sisters answered in reply, Honda, Hondo, Honda, Ro-da-da. And they came around the edge of the shore, singing and calling to her. And she knelt down to her son and said, come with me this one time so you know where you come from. And she breathed, three times into his mouth. And she took him on her back, and she dived into the water, and she took him down, down into the depths of the sea, down to the cave where the Selkie people lived, down to see the people that he came from, to see his own. But she knew they would not have long. So after a time where greetings were exchanged and blessings were exchanged, she took him back to the surface again, and she placed him on the shore and said, I can't be with you any more on land. This is where I belong. But I will come to see you. I will sing to you, and you know that you can come with me for a little time, from time to time. Know that even though I leave you, know that I love you. And so it was that this young boy had to watch his mother go back to the sea. But just as she'd promised, she came back to see him over and over again. And from time to time, she took him down into the deep waters, into the blue and the green and the black. And he always came back. And it's said that from that day to this, he was as at home on the land as he is on the sea. And it's said that all his descendants are the same, as at home in the sea as they are on the land. And many are born with webbed fingers and webbed toes, because they are the Selkie people. And we might like to think, oh, this is just a story. Well, it's a story I've told a number of times. I once told it in London in a theatre piece, and a woman came up to me afterwards crying, saying, I can't believe I came here tonight, because this is my family. We are descended from the seals. Another time, I told the story in Ireland, and a very hairy man with a big beard and very intense dark eyes thumped the table and said, I'm a Keneally, and my people are the seals. I told it once far across the water over in America in Boston, and at the end of the night, a woman with sleek dark hair and dark brown eyes came up to me, held up her hands, showed me her webbed fingers, and said, with a smile, they call me the Seal Woman. And with that, she left. So these stories are deeper and more true than we can begin to imagine.
So the story I'm going to tell you now is The Merman of Port Gordon. And Port Gordon is a little fishing village east of here along the Moray coast. And this is a true story. A long time ago, well, 1814 to be precise, two fishermen from Port Gordon set off to go fishing in their rowing boat. It was a fine early spring day, and the sky was a clear blue with just a few wisps of cloud, and the sea was calm. And when they got to about half a mile from the shore, they leaned over and they dropped their baited fishing lines into the water. And as they sank into the water, the sunlight danced off the metal baited hooks. And the two fishermen sat back and waited for the fish to bite. They had chatted about how one day they'd have a bigger boat of their own with a big crew and how many fish they would catch then. And with these happy thoughts, they looked out to sea. Each lost in their own dreams. But then, in the distance, they spied a figure. And both of them looked, and it seemed to be a man with his back to them, but he looked like he was sitting on a sort of rock or something. And the two men looked at each other. They picked up their oars, and they rowed towards it could get a better look. But when they got within just a few metres of this strange creature, the sound of the boat made it startle and look round. And it looked directly at them, and they looked directly back at him, for they said it was a man, and they could get a really clear look, and he had like green curly hair and small eyes, a flat nose, a huge mouth, enormous long arms, kind of tawny skin. But the strangest thing of all, that in place of legs there was a tail tapering down like a giant fish's tail. And then the creature just dived into the water, just leaving the end of its tail disappearing. The two men looked at each other, and then just a few moments later, two heads appeared, this time the same man with a female at his side. The two men looked at each other, and at that point they picked up the oars and they rowed back to the shore as fast as they'd ever rowed before, till the sweat was pouring off them, until they got back to the shore, and they put their boat in between two rocks, and they made their way as fast as they could to the local school teacher, George Mackenzie, and they told him just what I'm telling you now. And George Mackenzie, well, he believed them, because he wrote a letter that was printed in the Aberdeen Chronicle, stating that the men were honest and reliable and sober, and that he believed them. And the two men, well, they swore to the end of their days that they had seen a merman and a mermaid. And that's the end of that story.
So just along the coast a little way is the Black Isle, the Cromerty Firth, a place where there are many sightings of dolphins. People go there just to see them. But what these people might not know is it's also a place that is well known for sightings of mermaids. And I'm going to tell you a story about one of them. The Cromerty Mermaid. A long time ago, in the 18th century, there was a man called John Reed. He was a self-made man. He'd been born poor, the son of a widow. His father had been lost at sea when he was only small. So he and his mother had to manage the best they could without him. And he followed in his father's footsteps, and he went to sea. He began as a cabin boy, and he made his way up to the point where he was captain of his own ship, and he had a whole crew supporting him. And they say he was a good captain. They say he was a good-natured man. But they also say that he had a real sadness about him. And you'd wonder at that, thinking he'd had a lot of good luck in his life, so what was the sadness? Well, I have to tell you, he felt himself unlucky in love. Not that there were lots of women who would have been very happy to have partnered him. But oh no, He wasn't interested in any of them. He had his heart set on one woman alone, Helen Stewart. She was a lady. And when I say she was a lady, I mean she was landed gentry, very hoity-toity, and not likely to even notice the likes of him. So he found himself one Beltane eve walking the shore because he couldn't sleep that night, knowing that there were lots of folk pairing up and making whoopee all over the place. But he was on his own, and he couldn't imagine ever having the love of the fair Helen for his own. So he paced up and down the shore, feeling fair sorry for himself. And then he heard singing. Toora-loora-loora, toora-loora-lie, toora-loora-loora, mermaid swimming by. Now he'd heard about mermaids. He'd heard that sometimes you could see them. And he'd been told that mermaids, being of the other world, the elementals, they carried the fate of humans in their hands, and they could change your fortune. But only if you could catch one. Then you could ask the mermaid for 3 wishes. So he followed the sound of the singing, and he crept up close to where there were rocks by the shore. And what did he see sitting on one of the rocks but a mermaid with a silver tail and golden hair, singing to her heart's content, oh, and relaxing for a little while on the rock. He crept quietly behind her, and just as he was about to reach out to catch her, she realised he was there and she dived into the water. Well, he was one of the few sailors that could swim, and he dived in after her and he wrestled her, and she was strong, but he was stronger. So he managed to haul her up onto the rock and he laid her out. And he was gasping, and so was she, and they looked at each other eye to eye. And she hissed at him, "What do you want of me?" And he said, "I want my wishes 3. And she said, "Well, ask away. What do you want, mortal?" And he said, "My first wish is that my fortune will never change, that I'll always have good fortune. Will you promise me this?" And she said, "You shall have your wish. What is your second wish?" And he said, "My second wish is that I will never drown at sea like my father did." And she said, "Very well, you have your second wish." And he said, "My third wish is that I should have the love of Helen Stewart." And the mermaid said, "You have your wish." She wasn't given them willingly, but she knew when she was beat. And then she said, "Now let me go back to the sea, for you have your wishes 3. So, true to his word, he stepped back and let her go, and she dived into the sea. And it may have been a long time before that mermaid was ever seen again. But John Reed, soaked to the skin though he was, walked back along the shore with a lighter step, feeling happy with himself, trusting totally that his wishes would come true. And sure enough, as he was walking at the foot of the Suter, the hill, he heard the sound of laughter, young women laughing and singing. He looked up on the hill, and there was a group of the local women gathering the mayflowers on the 1st of May, because dawn had risen without him even realising. And there among the fair women was the fairest one of all. There was Helen Stewart. And he looked up, having the courage to gaze at her fully for the first time. And she looked back, and they looked at each other eye to eye, and he could see the colour in her face begin to rise. And she turned to her servant and she whispered, and they laughed, and the servant went down the hill towards John Reed. And she said to him, "My lady dreamt of you last night. She wants you to know." "Is that right?" said John. "And what did she dream?" "She was afraid for you. She dreamt that you were going to drown at sea. There was a strange woman singing to you, and she wasn't sure if she meant you good or ill." "Well, you can see that here I am, and I'm very well." And he stepped up the slope a little way, and he reached out his hand to Helen Stewart and said, "My lady, thank you for your concern for me. As you can see, I'm very well, and I wonder, would you care to take a walk with me?" And again she coloured and blushed red in her cheek, but she reached out her hand and she took his hand, and then side by side and arm in arm they walked back to the town. And from that day on they did walk together. John Reed married Helen Stewart not long after, and his fortunes were always favourable, and he never did drown at sea. Now again, you might think to yourself, well, here's a wee outlandish story straight from the sea, and who would believe in the likes of mermaids? But I can tell you this, and this is true. I once told that story over in Cromerty, and at the end of the telling, as people were leaving the room, there were 3 older women sitting near me, and they were talking to each other, and one of them said, "Aye, that happened to my grandfather. He met a mermaid, and that was his wish too. It was his wish that he would never drown at sea. And do you know, they all wanted to sail in his boat because they knew that if they were on his boat, they'd never drown at sea. And do you know this? He was in the war, and his boat got hit, but he wasn't worried at all because he knew he was never going to drown at sea. And sure enough, he was there on a raft, and he was rescued." So you tell me, is there not more truth in these stories than you could ever imagine?
So, I'm going to tell you another local story set around forests. And this is the story of Colbin. So, there are shifting sands around Colbin, and the villages are always changing, but there is evidence that a long time ago, this area was the granary of Moray, or the port of Moray. But even before that, there were fierce warriors living there, because flint arrowheads have been found. In fact, they're in Elgin Museum now, from 5000 BC. But round about the 1500s, it was a rich and fertile land where crops were grown, oats and cattle were kept, and there was fruit trees and salmon. Lots of salmon. And all these were exported, and imported there would be spices and figs and ginger and brandy and tobacco and hats, apparently all black. And there would be many different tongues and people there, quite a busy, thriving port. But there was always a battle between the land and the sea, and storms would rage and sandy storms would come and cover the land. And this is the local legend about that area. There was a laird, Alexander Kinnard, and he did not have a good reputation for treating his tenants and his workers and his cotters well. He had no respect for man, no beast, no God, nor the devil. He was always gambling and got himself into debt. And one night, in the house, the big house in the middle of all this fertile land, it was a Saturday night, and he was playing cards and gambling. And his manservant said, "Oh, sir, it's going to be midnight soon. You've got to stop gambling because it's going to be the Sabbath." Well, I'll play all day on the Sabbath if I like, even if I have to play with the devil himself. Thunder, lightning, storm blew up, and the door opened, and there stood old Nick himself. "Ah, I had an invite," he said. "Cards?" And so, "Yes," said the laird, "sit down." And so the cards were dealt. "What are we gambling for?" Well, they gambled his lands, he lost. Gambled his house, he lost. Gambled all his wealth and all his possessions, he lost. And he lost, and he lost, until he was there in his underpants. Nothing else to lose. And he said, "That's it then, I've got nothing else to lose." "Oh, but you have," said the devil. "How about we have one last game for your soul?" "Deal," said the laird. And so he lost. And as he lost, the storms raged and the sand came, and it raged for days and days and days until the whole of the estate and the lands were covered in sand, and not a house could be seen. And a few hundred years later, about the 1800s, old Jack was wandering around Colbin looking for the lost tobacco and brandy that is supposed to still be there. And he saw a chimney sticking out from the sand, so he popped his head down and shouted out, "Hello!" just for a laugh. And there was a manic laugh answered him. At which point Jack legged it back to the village, back to the town. But that is the story of Colbin.
So, time it is for the last tale. And before its telling, I'd like to thank, in particular, the Scottish International Storytelling Festival for helping us to put on this event. Creative Scotland also, who support Universal Hall Promotions, and the Findhorn Foundation, the owners and guardians of this beautiful building, the Universal Hall. Now all around Scotland it is possible, when you are at sail, that you will come upon a magical island, often floating hidden in a twinkling mist. The land of the ever young it is called Tiernan Oak, that place where always there is bud, blossom, fruit and decay on every branch. Now in the Northlands they call this place Utrest. Lucky are those who find it. Few indeed are those who see it. Fewer still those who are able to walk upon it. The sailors of old always knew if they had been close to Utrest, for they would find straw trapped in their rudder when they came back for sea, or when they opened up a fish, they would find grains of barley inside. And happy they always were if they found signs of Utrest on the catch or in the boat. For Utrest protected them all. It was a place of safety, a haven. And so to the tale, The Cormorants of Utrest, a folk tale from Norway. In the days when all things could talk, there lived a crofter named Isaac. A family he had, children and wife, and happy they all were. A couple of goats they had, that the wife would feed on scraps of fish and the poor grass that they had. And all was happy in their land and world, apart from their relations with the neighbour. The neighbour was much richer. He coveted Isaac's land, and they were never at peace with each other. This was the only worry in Isaac's world. One day, Isaac went out fishing. As he always did, he stayed within 2 miles of the shore, always in sight of land. But this day, a great storm blew up, and for 5 or 6 hours, Isaac's boat was tossed and twirled through enormous seas. So great was the storm that Isaac had to throw out all the fish he had caught, lest his boat sink. Finally, the storm abated a little, but still fog was everywhere. Isaac did not know where he was. He sailed on, lost at sea, and was dozing perhaps, when suddenly a great shriek, a cry, awoke him. Isaac thought the end had come, that the spirit of the sea would drag him down to the bottom. He prayed for mercy. He asked for help for his children and wife. And then, suddenly, floating past the boat, he saw 3 cormorants sat on a log, who turned and looked at him as he drifted past. Well, the boat continued on its way, and Isaac dozed at the rudder. For many more hours he travelled, until suddenly awoken he was when the boat grounded on a beach. And now he looked about him, and all was clear, bright sunlight, and he saw green rolling hills, meadows full of flowers, and fields of barley. And such was the sweet smell that came from the fields. And a little lane winding up through the fields to a peat-covered hut, on top of which, grazing, was a white goat with horns of gold and udders the size of a cow's. And in front of the hut, a kindly-looking old man with a long beard, smoking a pipe, dressed all in blue. And Isaac made his way up the path, and the kindly old man greeted him and said, "Welcome to Utrest." "Ah, it is indeed Utrest," said Isaac. "I thought it must be. Glad I am to be here. I feel the peace of the land." "Ah," said the old man, "you're very welcome, you're very welcome. You must come in, you'll be hungry and thirsty. But the only problem is, my sons, you see, they hate Christians. You'd be a Christian now, wouldn't you?" "Yes," said Isaac, "yes, I would be." "Ah, well," said the old man, I wonder, did you see my sons now while you were out at sea?" "No," said Isaac, "I saw nothing but 3 cormorants sat on a log." "Ah, that would be my sons," said the old man. "Well, they'll be home in a while, and I'll try and reconcile them to you being here. So away you come in, and here's the food and drink for you." And what a splendour that food and drink was, the likes of which Isaac had never seen in his life. There was plates of all kind of fish, and soup, cullen, skink, and more beside, and there was Arbroath smokies, and crab pâté from the Orkney Islands. It was a great feast of fish, but there was more besides. There was the goat's yoghurt and the goat's cheese, the hard cheese, the soft cheese, the miraculous cheese, and then the barley beer, the mead. Isaac sat down, and the more the old man filled his plate and his glass, the more there seemed to be on the table. The old man himself ate and drank little. Well, Isaac was near to being replete when he heard a terrible commotion outside, and the old man went out, and the commotion died down in the end, and in came 3 brothers, the sons of the old man, and it seemed the old man had made them comfortable with the idea of a Christian in their house, because they drank a toast to Isaac and told him tales of life upon the sea as a cormorant, and then said, "Isaac, you must come out fishing with us the next day." And so it was. The next day, Isaac went out fishing with the 3 sons, and he had his own lines with him for the fishing. But as soon as they got out to sea, a great storm came up again, and there was one of the sons at the helm, and one at the prow, and one holding up the mast, and they didn't furl the sail at all. They just shot straight through the storm, and all Isaac could do was hold on and bail for his life to get the water out of the boat that was pouring in. Well, when the sea eventually calmed, they threw their lines out into the water, and it seemed no sooner had the 3 sons thrown out their lines than they were hauling in fish. But Isaac, his lines, he threw out, and barely a nibble he got, and no fish at all. Well, they sailed the boat back to the shore, and while the sons gutted and laid their fish out to be dried, Isaac bemoaned the fact that he had caught no fish. "Don't you be worrying," said the sons. Here's 2 lines of ours. We'll go out fishing tomorrow, and plenty fish you'll catch then." And it was, the next day, exactly as they had said. Isaac had no sooner thrown out his lines than he was hauling fish in, and soon the boat was almost full with fish that they took back to Utrecht, gutted and dried. Well, many days, many weeks, many months Isaac lived there. Happy he was in that land. But of course, eventually he got homesick, and he said to the old man, "I need to go home now. I need to go home." And the 3 sons agreed, but they said, "First, before you go home, we have a new boat. We'd like to launch it. Come, sail it with us one last time." So they went down to the wee harbour, and there Isaac had never seen such a boat. It was 2 shouts long. It was that long. And 2 shouts long means that when the captain, usually the captain, at the prow of the boat, wanted to shout to the helmsman at the rear of the boat, there had to be somebody standing at the mast in the middle to relay the shout. So it took 2 shouts to pass the command from one end of the boat to the other. And so the boat was called 2 shouts long. So out to sea they went, and just round Utrecht they sailed and back to the harbour. And then the 3 sons, they began to load Isaac's fish, which was stored in the big new boat, in the dryers, into Isaac's boat. But it seemed the more fish they put into Isaac's boat, the more fish there was still in their boat. Finally, Isaac's boat was as full as it could be. And Isaac said, "How is it I am going to find my way back to Norway?" "Here's how it'll be," said the old man. "You'll follow a cormorant out to sea, and it will take you back to Norway. And if you should ever want to come back to Utrest, find that same cormorant and follow it back to us." And Isaac, he was given all kind of sailcloth and food and flour and things for his journey, and they loaded his boat up and waved him out to sea. And a cormorant flew in front of him through the mist. For when Isaac turned back, the island behind him had vanished. And through the fog and mist he went until he recognised again the coast of Norway. He sailed into Bergen harbour, and the fish that he had, the more he sold, the more he seemed to have. And so much fish did he have that he bought himself a new boat. And as he was preparing to sail that boat home, a friend of his came on board and said to him, "Isaac, now you'll find when you get home that your neighbour has died. Be kind to the children of him. And now your boat, everything that is upright will stay that way, and the mast will always be secure." And Isaac took that to mean that there would be invisible guardians on board his boat, caring for him ever afterwards. And he thanked his friend, and he sailed off home. And when he got home, his family so happy to see him again. And in the autumn, when Isaac beached his boat for the winter, he'd always make sure to leave an offering for the guardians of the boat. And when Christmas time came around, he'd hear the music of the violin. There'd be singing and dancing and bright lights around the boat. And Isaac knew that everything that was upright would always stay that way, and all was well with the world. And so I hope that everything soon will be again well with your world, if it is not already so. So thank you for sharing with us this evening. Thank you to Carol Scorer, Margot Henderson. Thank you very much, and good night.